Well, what a pleasure to be standing here introducing Nate Meyer on the very happy occasion of his defense. So I just want to say a few things, starting with when I met Nate. So I looked up today the occasion of meeting you, which was a certain person came to town and I couldn't remember their name, but I figured out their name. So I looked up the email invitation and it was in fact June 28th, 2011, that I met you for the first time. And I recall being very intrigued by this really interesting person in Extension. And so that's how Nate and I met. And after a few years, we started working together and collaborated quite a lot on things that kind of preceded your dissertation work. And Carissa Slaughterback was at the heart of that as well. So a bunch of work on trying to bring disparate folks together around complex environmental opportunities in the case that we were working on. And all the while, Nate's vision was forming, which was this idea that there was really something very significant and important in this matter of evaluation as a fundamental element of addressing complex opportunities and challenges. So I watched that vision sort of take shape and take coherence and turn into a scholarly agenda. And all the while, I was marveling at Nate's perseverance and stamina. So this is a person who was a father and a husband and was carrying out a very demanding day job and somehow managed to do a dissertation, which I just think is very, very impressive. And so I think those are the things that I wanted to comment on and highlight, Nate. And I will simply ask you to come up and begin your presentation. And so everyone, Nate Meyer.
All right. Thanks everyone, both online and in person, for being here today. And thank you, Nick, for those kind words and the introduction. I agree, we've had a long and fun journey together, looking at really innovative and interesting ideas over the years. So those of you who know me know that I have the unfortunate superpower of being inherently long-winded and wandering off topic. So I'm going to forewarn you all that I'm going to try to stick close to my notes today, just so I can cover things in a short amount of time and stay on topic. I'll be happy to answer questions at the end. My lovely wife, Becky, is also helping to monitor the chat. So those of you online, if you do have a question, you can feel free to drop it in the chat. And toward the end, we'll try to field some questions. But with that, I will dive in, hopefully, once I click here. All right. So providing for the needs of a growing global population while maintaining a healthy biosphere is an incredibly formidable and even existential challenge, especially considering the rapidly diminishing timeframes to deal with wicked problems like global climate change. Managing these problems increasingly calls for innovations to radically redesign the ways that we live and work in better balance with nature. Depending on who I'm speaking to, you might hear me refer to these as conservation innovation, social ecological innovations, or sustainable development innovations. But no matter how I'm referring to them, in the field of conservation, we frame this kind of innovation as adaptive co-management. Because of the complexity of the social and ecological systems that we're trying to change, these kinds of innovations require both collaboration among groups of people with very different perspectives and values who can engage in adaptive learning, or learning through trying and reflecting on what happens with different strategies. Studies suggest that the rate of failure for these kinds of efforts is quite high because a lot of different things need to happen at the right time and in the right way to make innovation possible. We have ingrained ways of living and working and even thinking about solutions that make innovations difficult. Disagreement can even become tension that ultimately stalls innovation. And while there is no benchmark, it can take decades to achieve innovation success. But given the growing magnitudes of the problems that we face, we really don't have decades. Luckily, it's theoretically possible for groups like Cooperative Extension, soil water conservation districts, and other locally situated conservation professionals like soil water conservation districts to help groups manage this kind of innovation and be successful. So my dissertation aims to support these organizations with resource and guidance to manage this kind of supportive process more effectively. My dissertation involved a sequence of studies that start with developing an integrative theory to pinpoint a certain dimension of the innovation process, and then working with experts to better define and understand how to strengthen that dimension of the innovation process, and finally field testing what I learned from those experts to help identify opportunities to strengthen innovation in one case of a partnership that I'll talk about later. Specifically, as Nick indicated, I explored how to strengthen evaluative thinking as an important dimension of innovation. Evaluative thinking is the dimension of innovation that involves critical thinking and pursuing deeper understanding through gathering and analyzing evidence in order to decide what to do next and track the development of innovations over time to strengthen success. And why evaluation? Can everybody see? I hope you don't see that screen sharing, do you, Beck?
No.
Okay, good. All right. Why evaluation? Well, there's a growing awareness that supporting innovation requires evaluation activities, but studies within the conservation community suggest that there's relatively little clarity about the different functions that evaluation can play or the conditions under which different kinds of evaluation are most appropriate. Most importantly, Wesley, Patton, and Zimmerman, in this very sort of central, highly regarded, often referenced work called Getting to Maybe, pointed out that many forms of evaluation that you and I are traditionally familiar with can actually be the enemy of evaluation. They can actually stall and resist innovation progress. So we need to be able to do the right kinds of evaluation at the right time in order to strengthen and support innovation. So the first step in my research involved a more careful examination of where evaluative thinking fits within the innovation learning process. I characterized innovation as a form of collaborative or social learning through critical reflection, through experimenting on different innovation strategies. I integrated a group of different reflective practice models to fit together like puzzle pieces, and then through twisting and turning them and fitting them together, I was able to clarify where evaluation tends to play an important role in fueling critical thinking about experiments to improve ideation or creative thinking about what might work well or what might be successful. Another way to look at this social learning process is through the lens of education. Bloom's taxonomy of thinking processes helps educators understand and differentiate between different forms of thinking that are inherent to how we learn and solve problems. As you can see, creative and evaluative thinking are among the highest order thinking processes, and in the context of innovation, they actually interact with each other. The way that Wesley, Patton, and Zimmerman describe this is that innovators tend to keep their heads in the cloud. They love to be inventive and think about novel ideas that could be. Evaluation helps them keep their feet firmly planted in the ground of reality and take stock of what actually happens in the real world and how their idealized innovation strategies actually play out. I also explored the value of a relatively newer approach, since it took me so long to finish my dissertation, called developmental evaluation that is specifically suited to the niche of innovation. Michael Quinn Patton developed this approach specifically to be effective in innovation situations where there's a lot of uncertainty, a high degree of variability from one situation to another, and it's likely that innovators don't entirely know what might happen and what might work, or they might only have half-baked ideas about what they want to do. Developmental evaluation approaches are intended to meet innovators wherever they are at in their innovation process. They're geared towards supporting development or helping them clarify assumptions, compare different perspectives and values, track the development of their innovation over time, to decide what to do next and help them answer questions about what might work. In developmental evaluation, evaluators tend to join in the innovation process with the innovators and also help them play meaningful roles in co-creating and practically timing evaluation strategies. It's been described as artful bricolage, through drawing on different inquiry and facilitation strategies to consistently make space for evaluation to strengthen innovation. And developmental evaluation can support and strengthen innovation success in a variety of ways. For instance, the long-term study of the McKnight Collaborative Crop Research Program has demonstrated that developmental evaluation approaches can help to strengthen and habituate reflective practice, adaptive learning, and evidence-based planning and decision-making, from leadership down through project teams and even individual innovators. So in my second study, I aim to work with experts to more clearly delineate what are important characteristics of evaluative thinking, effective developmental evaluation designs, and group capacities to pay attention in working to strengthen and support innovation efforts in the kinds of community-focused, action-oriented partnerships that people like me in Cooperative Extension are most likely to work with. I used a strategy called Delphi method that is widely used to reach expert consensus on how to manage complex problems or define complex phenomena. I identified a pool of 144 potential panelists and ranked these by their experience with developmental evaluation, conservation innovation, and projects focused on sustainable development as evident in their publications, presentations, or recommendations from other potential panelists. I used that to rank these potential panelists, and then I invited 12 to 13 of the most experienced panelists to participate in each round of my Delphi study. The panelists participated in 3 rounds of feedback to reach consensus on 3 frameworks of concepts describing evaluative thinking, effective developmental evaluation designs, and group capacities that support doing developmental evaluation. These frameworks each include 3 to 4 concepts, like you see up at the top, reflecting, 2 to 10 conceptual dimensions or statements that serve to define these concepts, and then also some indicators of how someone like me might observe these concepts in practice. And to provide my panelists with a more productive starting point, I conducted an informal scoping literature review at the outset of my study to develop an initial set of concepts and dimensions for each of the frameworks. So through a survey of literature, what I did is I identified a widely regarded, often referenced, but generalized foundational theoretical framework, in this case, the Joint Committee Standards for Educational Evaluation, that tend to be used across the across the evaluation field and across contexts in order to understand effective evaluation designs. And then I aligned statements in that theoretical framework with statements from developmental evaluation and conservation evaluation literature in order to arrive at a first round draft statement for all of the concepts and dimensions that was contextualized as possible to developmental evaluation approaches. I then had the panelists refine and prioritize these statements over the course of the 3 rounds. I used the panel's feedback between rounds to revise and prioritize the concepts and dimensions to share back with them for the next round of feedback. To do that, I asked them to share with me any open comments they had to revise and improve the concepts and statements. I asked them to rate on a 9-point scale the usefulness of each statement as currently written, and in rounds 2 and 3, I also asked them to rate the relative importance of paying attention to each concept and dimension. I used those numerical feedback then to calculate and use descriptive statistics like the median and the interquartile range to assess whether the panel reached consensus around the usefulness of a statement, and to help ordinate the statements, rank them in order. Over the course of 3 rounds, I revised statements that were either deemed less important or less useful, And then eventually in the third round, I asked the panelists if they would be supportive of cutting any concepts or dimensions that fell below the lowest quartile or below the last 25% of important statements in the mix. So now we can dig into the results. The first framework that I had the Delphi panel work with described evaluative thinking. Initially, it encompassed 5 concepts and 26 descriptive dimensions, with one addition during the first round. At the end of 3 rounds, the panel reached consensus around a framework that had 4 concepts and 17 related dimensions. Their feedback suggested that the focus is on valuing and using evaluation method and results, both for gaining perspective and for stimulating critical reflection. Important dimensions include learning through doing, asking big picture questions, and deliberating different perspectives that can stimulate and help structure creative thinking. The panel stressed the importance of reevaluating goals along the way if their experiences required them to do so. Panelists also downplayed the importance of futuring. You see, that is the concept that disappeared from this mix. While I didn't ask them specifically why, my sense is that futuring sits squarely in that boundary space between evaluative and creative thinking. And for this Delphi, the panelists were willing to let that be a part of creative thinking, not stick within evaluation thinking. The second framework that I asked the panel to provide feedback about encompassed evaluation design. Again, I used that framework that I talked about earlier, the Joint Committee Standards, which is a widely regarded set of evaluation design standards that include 5 concepts and 28 descriptive dimensions, to which the panel added 3 dimensions in the first round. After 3 rounds of feedback, the panel achieved consensus on 4 of these concepts and 20 related conceptual dimensions that characterize developmental evaluation designs as being co-created and integrated with other partnership activities to provide fair and dependable processes and results that group members value using over time to track and develop innovation. They actually reordered the concepts to focus more on utility and propriety, and accuracy, which they recharacterized in terms of practically addressing systems thinking and complexity. They also encouraged downplaying feasibility and actually letting go of accountability to avoid restricting the inclination that innovators might have to experiment and try evaluation and innovation strategies that might not work or involve risks. Finally, I asked the panel to provide feedback around important group and innovator capacities that enable doing and using developmental evaluation. The panel started again with a widely regarded framework, Foster-Fishman. Thank you, May Davenport, for turning me on to that. The panel started with, again, a set of 4 concepts in 34 dimensions after the first round of feedback. After 3 rounds of feedback, the panel reached consensus on a group of 3 concepts in 23 dimensions that uplifted the importance of strong relationships and group systems that support deliberative dialogue, power sharing, and flexibility inherent to group learning and innovation. Their feedback actually suggested that member capacities are something that can be developed over time and don't need to be pre-existing in order to make developmental evaluation have a good start. The panel also voted to cut this idea of innovation capacity or certain external conditions that make groups more capable of innovation. Again, I didn't ask them specifically why, but their feedback suggests that there was disagreement about what these conditions actually are in the context of these kinds of partnerships, as well as a concern, again, that paying attention to these kinds of concepts could restrict our willingness to start working with groups wherever they are at to tackle whatever challenges they face in order to make innovation possible. So again, we need to be willing to help groups get wherever they can in support of innovation. So taken collectively, these frameworks can be illustrated as a nested model where evaluative thinking is structured and strengthened by effective designs that are co-created and enacted by groups with supportive relationships, adaptive group systems, and the capabilities to participate meaningfully in evaluation. The last part of my dissertation involved using this model and these frameworks to look critically at the University of Minnesota's regional sustainable development partnerships. The RSDP is a particularly useful case study for me because it's a community university partnership focused on inviting and helping to develop community-based innovation projects across Minnesota that advance clean energy, community resilience, sustainable food, and natural resource systems. It's been around for more than 20 years and is therefore relatively mature, so I don't have to worry about things like early financial hurdles and the early formation of the partnership getting in the way of developmental evaluation or innovation capabilities. Moreover, the RSDP encompasses 5 regional boards and work groups that share some similar structures and aims, but also have somewhat autonomous ways of working and doing their innovation. So I was able to actually get a more substantial degree of diversity on which to base some of my findings. Over the past few years, RSDP has also been working on developing an innovative new theory of change, which is what you see in this graphic, for how they play a role in supporting and strengthening innovation. They have an interest in strengthening their evaluative thinking and evaluation strategies based on this theory of change, and they invited me to spend time looking at their case through the lens of developmental evaluation. So over the course of about 1 year during the pandemic, I spent over 100 hours surveying, observing, and talking with a wide variety of RSDP members and leaders to understand their partnership practices and learning processes. In drawing on this data then over an even longer period of time, I finally developed 2 case study articles that use the developmental evaluation frameworks as an analytical tool to illuminate opportunities to strengthen evaluation capacity and evaluative thinking. The first case study focused on supportive leadership that is one of the most primary and important dimensions of group systems and structures that enable developmental evaluation. It's widely recognized that supportive leaders are important factors both in enabling innovation, but certainly making developmental evaluation feasible. Michael Quinn Patton once said, "Ignore leadership at your peril." But we also have a lot to learn about strategies for enabling supportive leadership. Who are these leaders? What kinds of challenges and trade-offs do they face? And what are strategies to enable their support? These are the questions that I sought to answer. In RSDP, my findings suggest that partners have the positive working climate, the respect, the trust, the shared sense of opportunity that are key capacities to making innovation possible. They also perceive that they have incredibly supportive leaders. Specifically, they really value their group of 5 executive directors who provide overall financial and strategic leadership for the statewide boards and work groups. But I also learned that the regional sustainable development partnerships actually have more of a collective form of leadership. The regional executive directors work with a range of other community and university leaders in what I describe as a leadership structure that has focused responsibility. In other words, most of the responsibility for the financial management, for facilitating the partnerships, for working with community partners on innovation projects falls on those executive directors. But the structure also has distributed authority, where almost everyone in this diagram has some direct or indirect authority for decisions that influence the innovation and evaluation capabilities of boards and work groups. And this, I found, exacerbates certain challenges and trade-offs that lead to decision-making that is both supportive of the board and work group members, but also potentially counterproductive for strengthening evaluation. I'm going to talk about 3 of those challenges in depth. The first is a widespread perception that our plate is already full. Over the course of 20 years, the regional sustainable development boards and work groups have developed an annual cycle of meetings and activities that work for them, that they think are really important and effective. And they tended to perceive evaluation as something new that they would have to shove into this mix, potentially displacing some of these other important activities. Yet they also described a widespread value and a want for better evaluation, both to help them understand what happens in the innovation projects that they support, but also to draw connections between past projects that have been supported and projects they're supporting now, or to prioritize projects that they could support. I also witnessed evaluative thinking happening all over the RSDP boards and work groups. It was something evident in almost every board and work group meeting that I attended, and there are already efforts underway like process and survey designs and innovative data summaries that are intended to improve how the partners are sharing, accessing, and prioritizing different innovation project ideas. From the perspective of developmental evaluation feasibility, there are then opportunities to manage these challenges by working with leaders and members to reframe evaluation as part of their learning process and something that they are already doing and that is already happening and inherent to their innovation work. And then to focus on opportunities where leaders and partners are already making efforts to improve evaluation, as opposed to adding something new. A second challenge that came up is that we can't ask for more time from leaders and the largely volunteer board and work group members who are already involved in RSDP. This is highly supportive in terms of protecting the limited time that these individuals can contribute to the partnership. But it also exacerbates the tendency that I heard over and over for the regional executive directors to become overbusy in becoming responsible for everything, and in taking on most of the interaction with the innovation projects and work teams who are in communities. It also subsequently diminished the value that other partners and members have for using evaluation. In other words, there isn't much value to evaluating what you don't think you're involved with. So from a developmental evaluation perspective, there's an opportunity to work on expanding meaningful involvement of board and work group members with innovation projects and project teams all the way to the ground. I interviewed members who expressed that interest and described situations where they had been involved in various ways and where that involvement helped them better understand and better support innovation challenges and solutions. For instance, there was one situation where a board member became involved with a community garden project, and she was able to get RSDP support to help create that community garden. But in working with that project team, she came to recognize that in that community, they actually accessed land to create substantial amounts of agricultural space. So it was actually land access that was a more root cause of their sustainability challenge than just creating community gardens. So she was able to work with that group to pivot into a land access project and get further to that root cause and actually support more effective innovation. So from a developmental evaluation standpoint, efforts to spread responsibility for engaging innovation all the way to the community level may require a bit more time for each RSDP member, but it can also alleviate the overbusyness of those directors and allow everyone to become more involved in strengthening evaluation and have more vitality in that innovation process. And then one more challenge comes from the interaction of the RSDP directors and leadership within the partnerships and the broader community and university leadership that surrounds them. A situation that was described to me in a number of interviews is that there are institutional financial policies that are in place at the University of Minnesota, like annual budgeting, that are inherently supportive at an institutional level of helping all of us make effective decisions on effective timelines to manage funds and sustain operations. But these kinds of policies also create some limitations in the context of innovation, where there's a high degree of uncertainty in terms of how long projects will take and how they will unfold. So looking through the lens of developmental evaluation, get rid of this. I was able to develop some strategies and uplift some ways that partnerships have worked to circumvent these issues. In some senses, they behaved creatively. So for instance, they would allocate funding for 2 years contingent on a first-year report that allowed them to spread out that funding over time. In one case that I learned about, a board had voted in 1 year to support a select group of projects that they felt were related in tackling a particular innovation project, so they could go a bit deeper, again, following those university budgeting priorities. But in the same token, a widespread perception is that overarching institutional policies inherently limit how RSDP boards and work groups can thoughtfully invest their resources to support innovation over time and give patience to projects that encounter delays. So this suggests that to enable supportive leadership, it is also productive for developmental evaluation to have a willingness to work with outside leaders to find ways of aligning those institutional policies to better enable the kinds of flexibility and risk-taking that are inherent to innovation. My second case study focused on identifying opportunities to effectively integrate developmental evaluation to strengthen the RSDP learning processes. Drawing from my survey again, it's evident that fewer respondents strongly agreed that partnership activities promote inviting diverse perspectives, or that they can access and have ways of using evidence to test their innovation theories and the results of projects. So less agreement that they have strong learning processes in place that support evaluative thinking. And so I subsequently identified 2 core activities that happen in all 5 partnership groups each year that have certain attributes attuned to infusing developmental evaluation. The first is that every year, each of these boards and work groups has an annual meeting to critically review and update their priorities for community resilience, clean energy, sustainable food systems, and natural resources. All the board and work groups come together and they focus on deliberative discussion about these projects and priorities. Another of these activities is a slightly later meeting that they all have where they review idea briefs, or these concise ideas that communities and university faculty submit in order to describe potential innovation projects. And again, in this process, all of the boards and work groups come together to review these ideas, and again, they have deliberative discussions about strengths and opportunities to improve and support them. Both of these activities share certain strengths that are amenable to the infusion of developmental evaluation. The first is that both involve natural transitions between evaluative and creative thinking. They also involve forums where the most diverse groups of RSDP members come together for deliberative dialogue and perspective sharing. These activities also involve the creation and revision of documents that can capture and track the development of priorities and innovation strategies over time. So I apologize about this slide, but I couldn't figure out how to really get it concise. But the point is that we can use developmental evaluation design strategies to strengthen each of these processes. And taken holistically, these kinds of activities inherently involve certain learning boundaries that are essential for collaborative learning and reflective practice. Scholarship about the nature of learning communities suggests that it's the boundaries between our perspectives, between past and the future, between projects and priorities, that serve as a catalyst for collaborative and social learning. And my case study suggests that activities that involve critically reflecting on these kinds of boundaries are especially germane to stimulating and strengthening evaluative thinking without upsetting the other dimensions of that innovation learning process that, again, groups like the RSDP want to protect and uphold. I think this finding has particular implications for thinking about how we can design extension, soil water conservation districts, and other kinds of activities to be more supportive of these kinds of innovation. So the collective results of my case study of the University of Minnesota Regional Sustainable Development Partnership suggest that it is fundamentally key to the success of using developmental evaluation to strengthen group learning and innovation, that we focus on finding ways to avoid thinking about or practicing evaluation as something fundamentally different and split from other partnership activities and learning processes, or that we attempt to just drop evaluation in as something new and different. These perceptions and practices create challenges for both leadership and the members and create resistance to supporting evaluation. Key instead is to identify ways to infuse evaluation into the learning process. And that can happen through identifying the kinds of activities where there are natural learning and boundaries that invite and support evaluation, and for which evaluation can strengthen the utility and value for those learning processes. But also through working with leaders and members to see how they're already doing and working to strengthen evaluation, and how they can become more deeply and meaningfully involved in developing innovations and evaluation strategies. And finally, working with outside leaders to better align institutional policies and procedures to strengthen innovation. So the end. My research is significant in providing a foundation for the longer-term study of the regional sustainable development partnerships, much like the McKnight Collaborative Crop Research Program that's been studied over the better course of a decade. I hope that we can continue to work with the regional partnerships as an opportunity to develop a richer understanding of how community-university partnerships evolve over time to strengthen innovation. The frameworks that I've developed provide a more detailed description of evaluative thinking, effective designs, and capacities to support conservation innovations. These can serve as foundational diagnostics to be used and refined both for continuing the study of the partnerships, but also hopefully in other kinds of partnerships. Testing these with other partnerships can help us understand which characteristics are more important than others in helping support evaluation to strengthen innovation. Finally, the integrative theory, the developmental evaluation frameworks, and the case study examples developed through my dissertation provide important resources for the professional development of Cooperative Extension, Soil Water Conservation District, and other community-situated conservation professionals. My hope and goal is that we start to see these resources more fully and widely integrated into onboarding and training of these professionals to understand the importance of innovation as a collaborative learning process and to have the capabilities to more confidently and comfortably be equipped to infuse evaluation as a part of this learning process. So thank you very much for your time today. I appreciate it. It's hot in here. And you did make it.
Well, thank you, Nate. And we've certainly got time for some questions and discussion. And Becky, are you able to be the conduit for questions?
Yeah, there are no chat. There's no questions in the chat at the moment.
All right.
Just you wait.
Holy smokes, Al is here. Hey, Al.
It might be Sarah.
Could be Sarah. Any questions?
Oh, it is Al.
I feel like you should yell goal now, but we don't have time for that, Al. It's a story for later.
Nate, let me ask you one. When you speak of outside leadership as potentially having some role in this whole dynamic, say more about who those outside leaders are.
Yeah, so I actually talked about, so in the case study article that I developed, I focused on outside university leaders. So in the context of extension, it would be our dean, Beverly Durgan, or even collegiate leaders above her who are fundamentally setting like our annual budgeting, zero-based budgeting policies and timeframes. But there were actually, in interviews and observations, I saw this play out much more widely. So for instance, there are leaders either university or community-based who fundamentally drive every innovation project that the RSDP supports. And they have a lot of latitude in what they choose to do, on what timeline, with what resources. So again, the executive directors primarily right now are very heavily involved in interacting with those community-based project leaders in order to make the innovation work. And then even beyond that, there were some examples where, for instance, RSDP is trying to work more closely with Somali populations. They're trying to work much more closely with tribal populations. And in those contexts, they're actually encountering some cultural leaders who have specific ways of doing things within that cultural context that differ from the ways that it is done. One example that was given to me is, right now in RSDP, a person might be invited to serve as a board or work group, and it's sort of assumed that they can represent that region, but that doesn't necessarily work in a tribal context where there's a much more interactive culture. And so the university leadership was often mentioned. It was a good example, but it's actually much more widespread, and the leaders are constantly interacting and needing to work to align what they're doing with these broader external leaders. Yep.
So Joel Larson has said, congratulations, Nate, very well done. His question is, in your research or other experience, do you have any suggestions for how to address the challenge of creating time for evaluation for people who have an already full beaker?
Yeah, and I think, Joel, that's a great question. And it's not easy, but for me it comes back to that idea that if you look at what these groups are already doing, especially again in my context, if they're trying to develop innovations to tackle complex problems, chances are they're already practicing evaluative thinking. I remember, Carissa, when we started down this path together, there was one point where you said to me, planning processes inherently include evaluation. And it took me like 6 years to get there, but I totally agree, right? They do. What my dissertation, I think, has helped to do is enabled us to see and pick out that specific dimension of these integrated processes and figure out ways to strengthen that dimension of the learning process. So Joel, to answer your question, I think it's trying to see where evaluation is happening and what kinds of evaluative questions these people are already asking, and then dig into where you can help them. Don't try to build in that new thing, because then you're likely to raise resistance. Susie, you had a question.
Yeah, so you said in the beginning that you did your study with RSDP because it's a well-established organization. My question obviously has a little bit of biased motivation to it, but for an organization that is reestablishing itself, so shall we say, how does that, or does it change your recommendations for how to infuse the evaluation process for an organization that's still navigating those establishment waters?
Yeah, I think that seasoned developmental evaluators would love to dive in then and there and build from the ground up. Like, they would just be eager. Like, I think I know this organization and I would love to dig in. Like, I may be helping to direct that organization and I'd like to do that. But I think it also requires exercising patience. What I was drawing on when I talked about those early barrier hurdles, a person whose last name is the only one I can remember, sorry Heidi, I'm not the Mendeley today, is Marjoram. He did some work on some of the early barriers that face partnerships, and things like we're dealing with having enough finance and human resource just to get running, or like developing those relational capacities that are really important to developmental evaluation likely take precedence. So I think as like a more practiced evaluator, I might step back and think about how I can be supportive of those early processes and overcoming those early hurdles. I'd like to see evaluation be a part of that, but it might be that capacity development takes precedence for a little while before we get into deep evaluation. Yes?
Is it Trupti?
Trupti, yeah.
Yes.
Awesome.
She says, congrats. And then excellent study and presentation. Maybe one question. The framing of developmental evaluation can often be abstract for those, one, an evaluator, is trying to build capacity among PG staff at an organization. Was there any exploration about similar tools and approaches like design thinking and prototyping to build familiarity, ease of adoption in your study?
I didn't. So in my study, I sort of ended with identification of opportunities, but I do think there's a lot of crossover. And you're right. Part of the reason that I went down this road is that for all of you out there, developmental evaluation is this, I think, really well situated approach to evaluation. But because it so fundamentally prioritizes meeting innovators where they're at, and Michael Quinn Patton, who developed it, will say grabbing from whatever of the diverse academic research traditions and strategies you can use to support innovation, it sort of diffuses very quickly. And what I ended up doing when I was trying to find a case is constantly encountering people saying, yeah, but what is it? You're like trying to pitch me on this, what is it? So I think I understand better how we can see an effective developmental evaluation design and the targets to which we have to get, and that can help me see opportunities. I think we can draw a lot from design thinking kinds of traditions, but I haven't gotten there yet. That's what I'm hoping RSDP will keep working with me to do. Yeah.
I think mine is a bit of a clarifying question. So I think it was in the evaluation design piece in the second phase of the dissertation, whenever you were doing these panel discussions with folks, and it went from like 5 core things with a bunch of different dimensions, and then they mirrored it. In the last example you provided, you talked about they were a little, not dismissive, but maybe they didn't prioritize the, keep going back.
Was it the innovation? Yeah.
Yeah, the member capacity. So I guess my question is, again, for clarification, I think that you mentioned that they thought that those were less important in terms of like how the design was done, but to me, this member capacity is sort of like the people that are coming to the table to do the evaluation, and so how do they not carry that with them in terms of their values and commitments, or their ability to tolerate ambiguity and things like that? Like, again, maybe just for clarification.
Yeah, this surprised me too, because actually when you look at the first framework, member capacity is first, right? So it starts with building member capacities, helping them have good relationships, and they flipped it. The reason being that in order to have effective innovation, there has to be disagreement, right? So if we all share understanding and we agree on what we're going to do, then you've agreed, right? You're not sort of creatively thinking anymore. So there's this tension inherent, and that really fundamentally demands strong working relationships. So I think they really uplifted the importance of having those diverse perspectives and strong working relationships in place, and then the systems and structures that allow those to grow. And then again, their feedback was, it was sort of in the context of the comments they would share with me, like, we can build this kind of stuff. This is something that an evaluator can come in and help train you to understand better systems thinking. Patton actually says that there are certain characteristics, like a willingness to tolerate ambiguity, that he says are precursors, like you need that to be ready. The panel that I worked with more broadly downplayed that, and they were willing to feel like they could develop those along the way. Any other questions? Yes. Don't ask me about climate models. No coding.
Just about my understanding of what is he doing.
Yeah, you're right.
If you go forward a few slides, I think you had these groupings where you had university on the left side and community on the right side. And I was just looking at it and felt a little...
Oh wait, I want that way. Sorry.
Like,
Shoot. Could have been so much smoother. There you go.
This one. We had like project team members were like part of the core, but they were not part of the university group. So I'm just wondering, how do we like dissect the community and university groups and say this is mostly here, this is mostly there?
Yeah. So what I was doing is trying to lay things out with So everyone from the executive director to the left on this screen is a university employee, right? So the executive directors are extension employees. The statewide coordinating committee actually includes some community members, but it's considered a part of the oversight of the university RSDP. So I sort of layered those to the left. And then board members include a mixture of university faculty and community members. Work groups are more community oriented. They usually have, one or maybe two university faculty. Project teams are much more heavily tilted. So the teams that bring projects to RSDP to support are primarily, in my experience, community groups that are often then attached to a university faculty. So they might say, hey, we can help you with an undergraduate researcher or a graduate research assistant to help you with this, or we can help you with survey services. And then, again, then you can think about how those groups, all of the board members, community members are part of community organizations, identity groups. There's actually a slide that I didn't put in here that gets really theoretical because that's who I am. That is the quintuple helix that talks about how any partnership like RSDP is inherently embedded within larger systems out through cultural systems. And so this is sort of my way within the organization of showing that those directors exist within all of these different spheres of leadership that have some authority over influencing the partnership.
I just want to say I want to borrow this figure to show the reviewer who told me that using RSDP board members was not a good way to get community input.
Yeah,
say, excuse
right on.
me.
Yeah. Take it.
We haven't resubmitted the paper yet, so we can work with that.
Right on. Any other questions? Yeah, Jamie.
What was one of your favorite parts of the process of your PhD?
Good question.
What was a really enjoyable thing?
I love that. Honestly, it probably doesn't surprise you that I think it was the end. I was thinking about this on the way down, and I don't mean the end in terms of like wrapping it up and finishing it, but like it actually took me a long time. Although I was the person who worked with this panel of experts, who, by the way, are like my academic heroes, right? They're the people whose papers that I cite all the time. So I understand these items, and then I collected all this data, I coded it to it. And it took so long for me to see what, in retrospect, seemed like this really sort of basic conclusion that leadership is inherently connected to the feasibility of evaluation, right? Like, you would think that would just be obvious, but it took hours and hours of like staring and revising and connecting and thinking about how things are done. And then like all of a sudden there's this moment where you go, aha. And not only is it connected to feasibility, but it's connected to all 4 dimensions of feasibility. You didn't see that in the slides, but it's like, it's so connected to feasibility. Same thing with learning boundaries. I know that research well. I spit it out all the time. But when you can suddenly see it, that's just super cool. And then like these papers came together really quickly. I think Nick was really pleased after stalling. I'm like, blam, here's 2 case study papers.
Spring this year.
Right on.
Yeah.
There's a comment from Kathy Driver, and she says, on behalf of RSDP, we would very much welcome an opportunity to continue working with you on this, Nate. Our staffing boards have and do extensive design thinking exercises and would be a natural test ground for the use of those tools in evaluation.
Perfect.
And,
Kristen.
and this might follow up with that comment. So I'm curious, from your perspective, what do you feel like your biggest impact or your most important contribution to the field is as a result of your work?
When this is another good one. Thank you, Kristen, and one that again I was thinking about a lot on the way down. And I think that what I'm really proud of and what I will carry into the future is, again, this increased capability to see that evaluative dimension as a part of these innovation processes, where again, before it was muddy. Like, design thinking involves evaluative dimensions. It involves creative thinking dimensions. Planning process involve those. It's just, you couldn't separate it out and start to work on it. And so for me, it's like being a more intentional and perceptive educator in designing this kind of learning environment. At the heart of my work is the idea that we will support innovation through designing new kinds of programs and learning environments that bring the community and university together. And for me to be able to see where evaluation fits and start to isolate that and grow it is really important. I'd love to do this with creative thinking, right? I'd love to be able to do the same thing and think about, what is that really? How do we see it, and how do we start to uplift it? I just think even my prior degree was in education, environmental education, and we use Bloom's taxonomy all the time. And I am always writing learning objectives that say, evaluate. Another thing, not to get into the committee meeting, Gene, but I was thinking a lot about is, as a trained evaluator, I learned to do evaluation, right? So you create a plan, and you create tools, and you create... This has freed me to think about what I'm doing as supporting evaluative thinking, and to look critically at how I can do that, so I can be a part of that inquiry and educational process. And I just think that's huge. Becky, we worked on program innovation. We said that evaluation was one of the core practices that support innovation, and hopefully I've helped define and delineate what that means, so that now we can develop that along with creative thinking and trying things.
Well, I'm thinking this conversation could go on for a while.
That's a good sign.